Welcome to today's installment of Race and Bias Conversations. I'm Courtney Rainey, Assistant Dean for Assessment and Evaluation at the Graduate School, and I will be introducing today's conversation. The Race and Bias Conversations are discussions and talks aimed at helping Duke's graduate school community understand the many facets of systemic racism and bias as we work together to make Duke a more inclusive place. Today's discussion will take the format of a presentation followed by a Q&A session. In preparation of this Q&A session, you may enter questions in the chat at any time. After the presentation, the speaker will answer questions as time permits. Both the presentation and Q&A session are being recorded. During the presentation or Q&A session, the speaker or moderator may ask attendees to raise their hand. To do so, look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click the reactions button. Then click the raise hand button. This is how you would raise your hand in Zoom. You would click this very same button again to lower your hand in Zoom. Now to introduce today's speaker, Leann McLaren. Leann McLaren is a Ph.D. candidate in the Political Science Department at Duke who researches behavior and identity with a specific focus on race and American politics. Leann is a recipient of several prestigious awards, including a Summer Centennial Center Research Grant from the American Political Science Association and a graduate research fellowship from the National Science Foundation. We're very fortunate to be hearing about Leann's research today. Please join me in welcoming Leann McLaren to the virtual podium.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Courtney. And yeah, I'll just get started. I'll start sharing my screen in just a moment. Alrighty, I hope everyone can hear me well. I'm not sure I can tell, but so hi everyone, my name is Leann McLaren, and I'm super excited to be presenting the work that I'm co-authoring with Zoe Walker from the University of Michigan. We have this paper titled By Any Means Necessary, the Causal Effects of Protest Exposure on Black Political Attitudes. So what motivated much of our project was, of course, the era of racial reckoning that happened in the summer of 2020, when we see these massive amounts of protests happening all over the United States in response to the wrongful death of George Floyd. What became interesting to us about the Black Lives Matter movement was the fact that there was so much attention paid to it in 2020 as a result of these protests, even though we know much more that the Black Lives Matter movement had started prior to 2020. We know that it started as a viral Twitter hashtag in 2013 by the founders Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, originally in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. But since then, we've definitely seen it almost transpire into something else, into much bigger protests that really has shaped the national consciousness when it comes to the dialogue surrounding structural racism and police brutality against African Americans. But what has become interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement is a lot of the criticism it's gotten in the media as a result of the different types of protests that has exhibited all across the United States. This next picture in front of you is just some types of images coming from a lot of those protests in terms of the range is on peacefulness and to violence. Although the vast majority of protests that happened as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly in the face of the wrongful death of George Floyd, were peaceful, we do see that the media has almost a lot of attention that went to the different types of protests that were violent, anywhere from the burning of police headquarters to looting of several grocery stores. We see a wide range, and we see how the media likes to cling on to a lot of the violent different types of protests that happen as associated with BLM. In addition to this, we also see a lot of stigma that is associated with the support that Black Americans may have for BLM. There's a lot of presumptions that all Black Americans support BLM in the same type of ways, or that they're also the ones that are at these political riots. But what I will show in the following presentation, that it's a lot more nuanced than people may think when it comes to Black support for Black Lives Matter. And it's not necessarily all types of protests that are attended by all types of Black people. And this figure here, excerpted from the US Crisis Monitor, which is the ACLD, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, in partnership with the Bridging Divides Initiative. They had collected this data on the amount of Black Lives Matter protests that had happened from May to August 2020. And you can see here, this is another exemplification of the fact that the vast majority of protests by BLM were peaceful, but you do see the magnitude in the places that they were violent. But again, my co-author and I are really interested in the disparities of the different types of media portrayals that happened as a result of the different types of movements that had happened, and how this really affects the different types of public opinion by those who may have much to gain or lose from the movement itself. And another important fact to showcase is the fact that the data from this study also just shows the sheer magnitude of the amount of protests that happened in 2020. Around over 10,000 had happened just in that period alone, in over 2,400 counties across the US, just adding more importance to the nature of studying BLM. But nevertheless, all of this points us to the main research questions that I'll be discussing here for the project, which looks at what are the political effects of exposure to racial justice protests for Black Americans, and does the type of protest activity matter? So when we're looking at the literature in political science that essentially tells us a lot more about the studies of racial identity and its importance to Black political behavior, we know that there essentially attachments to racial identity in a type of psychological sense serves as important motivational factors for Black Americans to participate in politics generally, and this is also inclusive of social movements. However, when we're looking at this literature, much of it focuses on the civil rights movement in particular, and just more recently, we're thinking about determinants of support for BLM, but the vast majority pays attention to a lot of how white Americans in particular view the movement, anywhere from how white Americans view certain rioters when it comes to the race of the protester, or anything from the race of the victim, are all the types of projects that other people have looked at and found interesting results. But we still see here there's kind of a gap in the literature when it comes to how Black Americans actually view Black Lives Matter and whether there is enough variation in the first place. Because again, like I had mentioned, there seems to be this general presumption that support is essentially constant, and it's just kind of something that is just generally known to support for. So yeah, there's that. But again, when we're thinking about different types of protest behavior or support for protest behavior among African Americans, we see that it's not as high or varied as we may, well, it is varied, but it's not as high as we may think. So the figure in front of you is essentially a time series of, it's taken from the American National Elections Study, subsetted to just include Black respondents. And it's just showing you over time from 2000 to 2020, how respondents had indicated whether or not they had protested. And we see here, it's only about, at most, close to 25% of respondents that are saying that they're actually participating in protests, which is an interesting finding in and of itself, because again, we see that there's some type of stigma or assumption that majority of African Americans are on the ground protesting. And of course, there may be some bias with this data. We may not actually be able to get all the activists that are on the ground from the ANES, but it nevertheless tells us just a different story when it comes to support and when it comes to participation in political behavior. And of course, this is not to single out African Americans at all. Majority of Americans generally, as we know from political science, don't actually participate in politics all that much, especially when it comes to protests. But again, it just shows the different pictures that we're seeing from the media. And then again here, this is a graph of data from the 2016 Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey. And this is just a subset from Black or African American identifying respondents. And again, we see some variation when respondents are asked about their perceptions of BLM as an effective movement to resolve inequality. It mirrors much of a normal distribution, but again, it just shows you it's much more varied than we may think from what the media tells us alone. Although sizable amount of respondents, about 40% or 60% alone, think that the movement is somewhat or very effective, we do see about 30% saying that they don't believe it's effective at all, and around 10% that said they don't even know. So with all of this, this essentially tells us thus far that there is some type of variation in predicting the different types of attitudes that Black Americans may have in response to Black Lives Matter. It's not as constant as we may think, and that there may be something here to explore when we're thinking about how Black Lives Matter is portrayed in the media with different sources, in particular as it's associated with different types of protest behavior. So when we're thinking about this, now we're thinking, okay, there may be different types of variables that are also affecting the relationship that we think is going on between perceptions of BLM and protest demonstrations, and its effect on several indicators of interest, anywhere from political efficacy, perceptions of BLM, as well as different public opinion issues like defunding the police and so on and so forth. So my co-author and I had came to agreeance to looking at factors such as racial trust and fatigue. We did explore other factors that had more closeness to identity that are more traditional moderating factors. Seen a lot of political science papers such as group consciousness, which is just some type of measure of affinity with your identity as a Black person, and others. But we ultimately found that it was less variation than we had thought, because we did generally seeing a type of story of a shooting of an unarmed Black man shot everyone's identity up. But nevertheless, we were interested in these two factors, racial trust and fatigue, as moderating the relationship. This mainly comes from the sense that political trust itself is seen as fundamental to the nature of democracy. Trust is needed for generally people to have some type of faith or trust in the government. It's going to do what it's going to do, or in abiding by laws. And we think it's the same thing here when we're thinking about how Black Americans are perceiving BLM to be an effective movement. We think that there's some level of trust that has to be in the nature of being able to demand rights or demand different types of political objectives itself. So we thought that respondents that have varying levels of political trust is going to affect how they view the articles and how it's going to affect several questions we ask after. And then secondly, we also looked at questions of racial fatigue. Racial fatigue is an interesting concept because it's not traditionally studied in political science as motivators for certain types of political action. Most of the work we found that tested it was mainly outside of political science in areas of like social psychology, and they're all looked at it as a type of concept that came up, particularly among Black men in institutions of higher education as a result of microaggression, and how that caused some type of demobilizing effects when it came to pursuing racial activism. So we were interested in exploring that, given the nature of social media and the way that 2020 became that summer of racial reckoning, where you see the constant videos being shared of George Floyd and the gruesomeness of that. And we really wanted to take in consideration how people's just mental fatigue associated with seeing all those images in the first place may also affect how their reaction to these media articles and how it's going to affect how they perceive BLM, et cetera, et cetera. And then this next slide is essentially reiterating that concept of political trust being a potentially effective moderator when we're thinking about how it's affecting how Black Americans view different protests. So this is data from the 2016 collaborative post-election study, again, with Black Americans. And we see here that essentially, when we look at Black survey takers who were high in trust, they were significantly different than people who were low in trust in seeing BLM effectiveness. And this is just a difference of means tests, where essentially, if you're higher in political trust and you're a Black person in the survey, you're more likely to think that BLM is effective at promoting or solving inequality, as well as just protests in general. So again, we see that this is an important moderator, and we're thinking of including it in our own survey or experiment. So this is just a general overview of the model. So in our survey experiment, we vary the level of protest disruption in several different experiments that I'll go into a bit later. And we believe that the respondents' level of trust in government as well as racial fatigue is essentially going to affect how these different media articles are changing people's policy attitudes and perceptions of political efficacy. And this brings us to the formal hypotheses that we test for our project. The first one is basically predicting that overall respondents exposed to a protest will perceive the Black Lives Matter movement to be more effective than respondents who are not exposed to a protest in association with a certain story. The second hypothesis is essentially predicting more variation in that, where we believe that respondents exposed to more disruptive protests, and in this case, we tested burning and looting articles as compared to those in less disruptive conditions, and that those in the burning and looting conditions will perceive BLM to be more effective. The second and third hypotheses essentially are looking at the moderators that we're interested in terms of political trust and racial fatigue, where we just think that there could be support for either or. It could be the case that people high in trust could, love the burning articles and feel that BLM is more effective, or they could hate them. We kind of figured that it could go either way. So we're just going to say that we think it's going to be an important moderator, but not necessarily call on what direction the relationship would be for either of them. So now I will get a bit more into the experimental design that we did for the surveys to test these hypotheses amongst Black Americans. And this next slide just brings a general overview of what we manipulated. So we have a control group as well as 3 treatment groups, and respondents were randomized into one of these 4 conditions. So essentially in the control group, it was just the article, and these were all fictitious, completely made up, IRB approved. And post the survey, all the respondents were informed that this article was completely fictitious. But I do have to give it to my co-author, Zoe Walker. She did an amazing graphical display in making these articles look pretty real. But nevertheless, the control had the story where it was just a fake mock story of a police fatally shooting an unarmed Black man in St. Louis University, or St. Louis area, and he was taken to the hospital. The next 3 treatments essentially still have that story, but we vary the degree to which the protesters that responded to that event, whether it was peaceful, whether they looted a grocery store, or whether they set fire to an empty police headquarters. And the language in all of the highlights just shows the ways that we changed it from each article. And then this is just the rest of the information that was in all of the article conditions that was just constant, but it just shows you more about the story, essentially. And then this is just exactly what the respondents saw in terms of the article setup. Again, this is just the burning or the looting condition in of itself, but this just shows you what respondents had saw. And now I'll get a bit into the data collection and a bit of the demographics of the sample. So with the results I'll show today, this is essentially a pilot collection that we had done through Cloud Research, which is primarily, or used to be prime panels, which is essentially supposed to be a higher degree of data than MTurk. But essentially, it's just a smaller pilot data because we are planning on doing more data collections and applying to bigger grants to get larger samples. So then nonetheless, it'll be helpful to get a lot of feedback on the general project itself, because we do have some room to make changes for future collections. But nonetheless, it was 245 Black respondents. We had a couple of pre-test demographics. So the median education was some college. The gender was split about 50-50, was about 104 men, 148 women, 2 non-binary, and the median age was around 33 years old. The moderating factors of interest, political trust, and racial fatigue. I'll go a bit more into the scale that we had created for that in the next slide, but that was a part of the pre-test questions. Then respondents were randomized into one of the 4 articles, and the post-test measures were political efficacy, the degree to which they agree that violence is necessary to achieve political goals, BLM effectiveness, as well as a specific type of wording on reducing police budgets, which essentially we didn't want to outwardly ask respondents, do you support defunding the police? Because we believe it's really charged and we won't be able to control for all of the other narratives that were going on at the time. So we asked it in a way of, do you support reducing police job budgets to fund social services? So for the analysis, we just did ordered OLS regression to estimate average treatment effects. We dichotomized those who are high and low in political trust and fatigue for the simplicity of the graphs, and we converted the coefficients from the OLS regressions to predicted probabilities just for ease of the visual summary, given that they were interactions and it's a bit more complicated to show those straight from the regressions alone. So going into the actual summary of the results. So here is just essentially the distribution of political trust. So we had asked an array of questions regarding respondents' perceptions of trust in government. And this table here essentially shows you how the range is. So 0 is those who are low in political trust and 1 are those who are highest. And we had some type of notion that most of the sample would be on the lower end, given what a lot of the literature has stated on the relationship of government and trust with African Americans in particular. So we knew that a lot of the sample would be on the low side. And that's a bit true since we see about 15% of the sample alone have the lowest amount of trust. But outside of that 0 mark, we do see somewhat of a normal distribution where a lot of people are clinging in the middle when it comes to trust, but there is a negative lean. This is the distribution of racial fatigue, which is another scale of 2 questions. Political trust was 3 questions, and this was 2 questions. And this one was actually a bit contrary to what we had actually expected in terms of the degree to which respondents reported feeling mentally fatigued about the situation going on with police brutality, all of the news of unarmed Black people getting killed. About 15 or over 15% said they don't really indicate any type of fatigue, which was interesting. But the rest of the sample has a bit of a normal distribution where, again, in the middle, we see most of the respondents clinging, and then a sizable amount that have the highest level of fatigue. And then this here is just as a table that summarizes the results of the 5 OLS regression models. I'll go more into detail of the specific results in the graphs that are going to follow this, but this just goes to show how we set up the models. The first 3 are just the effect of the treatments alone on BLM effectiveness, and then the rest are the interaction terms with trust and fatigue dichotomized, and we'll see more into the results. So when we're thinking about the first hypothesis, that was essentially testing the extent to which exposure to a protest as associated with the story, absent whether it was violent or not, would boost support for Black Lives Matter and perceptions that it's an effective movement. And we do find some support for this hypothesis where respondents that were in the burning conditions and the peaceful conditions were significantly more likely to perceive that the Black Lives Matter was effective. And you'll see that generally, and this was significant at the 0.01 level, which is pretty high. So you'll see generally with a lot of these results, it's mainly the respondents in the burning and peaceful conditions that move in the same direction. So we find support for the hypothesis that when the story is associated with a protest, people believe BLM is more effective, but that there doesn't seem to be much difference between whether it was in a burning or peaceful condition. We see slightly more results for peaceful, but interesting nonetheless. And then for this question, and basically all the other questions, looting did not have a significant effect, which I'll get more into like what we may think that have meant in later slides. Now moving on to the results for political trust and the moderators for that. So on the question of whether Black Americans believe that they have a say in how government handles important issues, this is one of the political efficacy questions. We see again here that respondents in the burning and peaceful condition had significant effects, but this varied on whether respondents were high or low in trust. So essentially, respondents that were high in trust relative to the control were significantly less likely to believe that Black people have a say in how government handles important issues in both the burning and peaceful conditions. And this worked the opposite for people who were low in trust or have low faith in government, where those who were low in faith in government were significantly more likely to believe that Black Americans have a say in government and how they handle issues in the burning and peaceful conditions. And then again, we see a similar relationship on the question of whether respondents believe that violence is necessary for Black people to achieve political goals. We see again a type of difference that's going on dependent on respondents' level of trust in government or political trust, where again, respondents who are high in trust relative to the control were significantly less likely to believe that violence is necessary when they saw the burning in peaceful articles. And this worked the opposite for people who are low faith in government, where they were significantly more likely to believe that violence is necessary given they saw the burning or the peaceful conditions. And we do think most of the results or the significance of the results are driven by high trust respondents, because even from this graph alone, you can see that it's a bigger drop for high trust respondents than it is a bigger uptick for low trust respondents. And again, looting was not significant. On the question of the defund the police question in terms of whether respondents believe that or held support for reducing police budgets to fund social services, we see here that it was only the burning condition that was significant, where those that were high in trust were significantly less likely relative to the control to support defunding the police when they saw protesters burning the building, and this was one of the most significant drops when it came to high trust respondents. And we do see an uptick again among low trust Black respondents. When they saw the burning article, they were essentially mobilized to the issues of defund the police, which we found was really interesting. But there was no other significant effects for peaceful in this case or looting. And now to the last result, we didn't see as much strong results or consistent significance for the tests of racial fatigue. It was only one question that racial fatigue had a significant moderating difference among those who were low and high. And in this case, we see a similar relationship to the other ones where relative to control, those who are high in fatigue were significantly more likely to believe that issues affecting Black people are too complicated to understand. And those who are low in fatigue, well, actually I may have said that backwards. Those who are high in fatigue are significantly less likely to believe that issues affecting Black people are too complicated. And those who are low in fatigue are significantly more likely. So essentially it seems like those who are high in fatigue are getting some type of clarification on the issues affecting Black people when they're in the burning and peaceful conditions, which kind of makes sense, given that we thought that people who are high in this type of racial fatigue will essentially seem more alienated from politics generally, because they're tired from seeing all the things that are going on with BLM. But when they're seeing burnt people, protesters in particular, doing something in whether it's burning the building or peaceful demonstrations, they seem to be more, they seem to have clarity on the issues that are going on. So that was actually a really interesting result as well. So essentially to conclude and wrap this all up in a bow, kind of, I'll just go over a summary of the general findings. So essentially we found support that when the Black Lives Matter movement is viewed as more effective when it's associated with a protest, particularly in response to a tragic story surrounding a Black person at the fate of police. We also found that essentially the type of protest activity seems to matter. In this case, it was mainly those who saw the burning, the police headquarters. And I don't know if I clarified, but there was nobody other than the story was hurt. So it was like an empty police quarters that we had put in. But nevertheless, those who saw that article and the peaceful article seemed to have caused the most movement among political trust in particular, and those with mental fatigue, and less for looting. when it came to the looting results, we think that it may be because there's not really a direct connection between people looting in response to the tragic story about an unarmed Black person, because there's not a direct target, where I guess burning of a police headquarters and protesting peacefully in front of City Hall does have a direct target related to government, at least, but that's what we're thinking. And then we also found that essentially trust in government was a strong moderator between Black people's responses to disruptive and peaceful protests equally, essentially, where, you know, people who are high in trust and have a lot of high trust in government were almost demobilized, or had more negative connotations when it came to the movement, views on political efficacy, and defunding the police than those who were low in trust. They seem to have some type of boost in believing BLM is effective, political efficacy, and et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, it was only really one question that we saw that racial fatigue seemed to moderate it, in terms of whether, I think it was one of the political efficacy questions, in essentially saying that those with high fatigue seem to get clarity on the issues when it's associated with a burning or peaceful protests, which gives, I guess, some type of hope to the types of protests going on, giving some people more clarity or efficacy in the ability for BLM to be successful. And generally, I'll just close out the presentation by bringing in this Malcolm X quote. This is actually Zoe's idea, but I think that the quote gets at the heart of the project, which we're really interested in, looking at the different determinants of different types of protest activity and what this really exemplifies on Black Americans in particular, and the routes that they feel are appropriate for, you know, getting freedom. And, you know, Malcolm X in this quote talks about wanting freedom by any means necessary. And I think that sentiment is captured a bit in our study. So thank you so much for your time and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much. We have certainly come to that time in our conversation to have a conversation with Leann. So as you are comfortable, I invite you to turn on your video. I also ask you respectfully, if you raise your hands, my colleagues and I will be monitoring the chat for your questions. And again, we appreciate your participation today. Leann, I wanted to begin. You mentioned that you wanted to return to that notion of looting. And I want to ask you, what do you think, why was it that looting, it was not significant for support BLM, correct? What are your thoughts about that? Because that's I was like, it's a little bit counterintuitive to me, but as a social scientist, we understand that, and that is one of the findings of the significant findings of your study. It's like, ooh, looting is not significant, and I'm like, that's interesting.
Yeah. It's hard because okay, our original predictions were like, you know, we thought that peaceful, you know, in terms of the scale of political violence on protests, peaceful is like the most peaceful, and then looting was intermediate, I guess, and then burning was the most. And it's hard to say why exactly looting wasn't significant. Like I said before, like the original thought around it was the fact that there's not a specific target, like at least for the burning one, even though we thought it was going to be the most violent, and especially among those who feel the most alienated from government, would feel, I guess, the most moved by burning, but it was the same for burning and peaceful. But nevertheless, for looting, yeah, I guess when because it's just looting a grocery store, there's not a direct tie to like government being able to advocate for certain things to a certain political body of power. But I don't know. The thing is, it was still in the general directions. It just wasn't significant. So perhaps it could also be like a low data issue. But I agree. I'll have to think more if you have any suggestions about what that may be.
Thank you. I see our colleague Jasmine. Jasmine.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Leann, for this presentation. I thought it was really great. And I think your question of, you know, learning how Black people feel about Black Lives Matter is super important and super interesting. So I just had two things that I thought were kind of interesting in your results. So the first was actually just your graph of the percentage of people that participate in protests from the American National Election Studies. And so first of all, it's not that many, right? I think you said the most was 25% of people in any given year. But what I thought was super interesting was the 25% happened in 2008 and not in 2020. So I don't know when they surveyed people in 2020, but I just wonder what you think of that. Why you think it was way more people participating in protests in 2008. And the second thing that I thought was interesting in your results from your experiment was particularly when you were looking at the conditions like with trust, the control condition, like there was already so much support in the control condition for Black Lives Matter for each of your dependent variables. And so one that might be like, there might be a ceiling effect, right? It might be conditioning for all of your other treatment conditions, but also can you just talk about like this idea, to me, how I'm interpreting that is that Black people are generally supportive of Black Lives Matter, and we can see that from your control condition. So those are sort of the two things that jumped out for me. But again, thanks for this really wonderful presentation.
Yeah. Could you go over the first thing you said again? Sorry, I got lost.
Yeah, it was mainly just that the highest percentage of protests, I think your data was from 2000 to 2020, was in 2008. 25% of people were protesting in 2008. And 2020, it wasn't that amount. So thinking about what's happened, what's the context that's happening.
Yeah, that is a really, really good point. So yeah, I did notice that it was in the Obama years that we see people like self-reporting, at least, that they're involved in protests on the ground way more, which was a bit shocking considering that 2020 is supposed to be the summer of racial reckoning. And, you know, there is this massive influx of protests. And we also presented these results at the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And someone had said, like, perhaps, you know, it could be a bias thing where you're not exactly capturing all the activists that you could in the ANES, perhaps they're not at their computer. That could be it. But someone else did say that, you know, it's not entirely shocking because even though the uptick was around 25% in 2008, I guess relative to how low it already is, I guess it's not that dramatic, if that makes sense. Like, yeah, it was an uptick, but it wasn't that different than what the mean was, if that makes sense. So in my mind, I guess that would have to mean that, I lost my train of thought. But essentially that protest, it seems like protest participation generally is just really lower than what you would think. And yeah, it seemed like it's perhaps the election Obama did mobilize people a little bit more, but generally people are not out on the streets as much as you think. And it's a lot less than the media even portrays it. So yeah, I guess we'd have to think more about what that means, but yeah, it's interesting nonetheless. But to your second point, about the ceiling effect. So you're definitely right, because when we're looking at other moderating factors, especially more closely related to like Black identity and consciousness, those variables never moved when it came to like the difference between them in the control or the treatments. And we think that's generally because just hearing about the story of an unarmed Black man being attacked by police I think is just driving up a lot of support for BLM in and of itself, even without a protest, and even associated with the identity variables. So that's that. But then I do think it's interesting though, that when people are in the burning or peaceful, especially for high trust people, it goes down, it seems, in significant ways. So there is like a lot of support for BLM baseline, and you're right about that. But it definitely seems interesting that given how the media is talking about BLM with these protesters, that can move support a lot too. So I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, it's just a lot to think about.
Hey, Leanne, I'm just going to echo Jasmine's comments too. I think this was a very informative project and I think a very important one to assess really diversity of opinions amongst Black people on Black Lives Matter. And so my question is kind of similar to what I just said and also related to like your research on this. And so I want some clarity on your respondents, like specifically, are you distinguishing between Black respondents and African-American respondents? And is there reason to believe that Black immigrants or second or third gen Black Americans would have different attitudes on Black Lives Matter versus African Americans who've traced their lineage back to slavery?
It's funny because, you know, I look at a lot of this on my other projects. I'm interested in like immigrant heritage and ethnic diversity within the Black community. So with this pilot, well, with all the data, I think we grouped all Black Americans regardless if they were immigrants or not. In the pilot study that we had done, I don't believe we had room for a question that asks about recent immigrant ancestry versus multiple generations in the United States. I usually distinguish it by recent immigrant ancestry versus not, because of course there's other slave descendant Caribbean immigrants that come in. But nonetheless, there is a type of ideological difference that pops up a lot of time when it comes about questions of racism and inequality in the United States. So I wouldn't be able to tell you the differences of that based off these analysis because we didn't ask that question. But if thinking going forward, it would be an interesting question to think about from the literature that I had read, particularly because of Opal Tometi, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. She is a particular Black immigrant rights activist. She founded the Black, I believe it's the Justice for, it's something with, it's just a sub-organization of Black Lives Matter that pays attention to the different types of issues of Black immigrants pertaining to documentation and different types of immigration laws. So from that, people haven't directly tested whether that has increased support or leveled off support in the same way that it does for African Americans for BLM. But based off of my, I guess, hunches, I would say that I do think because of her sub-organization that probably draws some support for BLM than previous movements because there's more of an attention to ethnic diversity in the Black community. But I'd have to think more about what that would mean for our direct treatments with burning and peacefulness. I know there's more conservative ideologies within Black immigrants that people have found sometimes. So that could perhaps lead to results being more negative for things like the burning condition, because people burning buildings kind of gets at the heart of anti-respectability politics. So that's what I could think of and, you know, think going forward. But yeah, good question. Thanks.
Hi, Leanne. I had a question kind of following up on the thread that Jasmine raised earlier. You know, looking back at 2008 versus 2020, and I mean, not to be that person, but I'm really curious, you know, if you have ideas about how social media may be playing into this and smartphones, because I remember way back in the day, like the first iPhone came out in 2007. And then since then, I mean, there was social media before, but it was like nothing like it is today. And I wonder about that in terms of, you know, social media protesters, where they aren't showing up in person, but they're participating in the movement in their own way. And then also wondering about, you know, like you're mentioning the racial fatigue, you know, sometimes my husband can't even, he's like, I can't do social media right now because everything I'm seeing, everything is about, racial angst, systemic racism, and it is exhausting. So I'm just curious what a political science scholar, thinks about, or knows about the impact of, social media when you're looking at these types of questions.
Mm-hmm. So you bring up an excellent point. So as you were talking, I was thinking there's another important factor with 2020 when we're comparing it to 2008, which is of course the pandemic. I don't know the extent to which, it was a health risk going out and outside to participate, and whether that also affected people just not going to protests, because that was pre-vaccine. That was also back when a lot of the data reports were coming out in terms of how COVID was disproportionately affecting marginalized communities due to things like access being in different types of urban segregated communities, et cetera, et cetera. So that could be one thing. But in terms of social media, you do bring up a good point. So I guess clarifying wise, are you saying whether you think there's a tendency for people to do more activism on social media versus on the ground when it came to BLM?
Well, I'm truly just asking. I'm
Yeah.
just curious what someone in the political science space, what are things that you think about when you do this type of research
Mhm.
in a place where people may be protesting in person and also digitally?
Yeah. Well, that's a good research question, because I don't know if people have thought about digital support like that for BLM outside of the protest realm. Because there was I remember a specific week in 2020 when there was a lot of campaigns that were just we're going to block out all the other information that's going on in social media to only pay attention to what's going on with George Floyd. And that in a sense was a form of BLM demonstration. It's just online. So that would be another interesting way to fill in the gap in terms of help explaining why we didn't see people reporting that they were on the ground protesting as much as they did in 2020. I don't think that has been talked about as much in the political science literature on BLM. I do know that there is some work by Alvin Tillery, I believe at Northwestern, that looks at how the movement is framed on Twitter in terms of the intersectional frames pertaining Black feminism and other underrepresented populations in the Black community, and how that affects different types of how Black people respond and support it. So that's the extent to which they've done social media work on it, though. But that is a really good question in terms of social media activism that could help explain why it was as low as we did see.
Thank you. One of our colleagues says that hashtag activism might be a way to get this question, at least as an initial measure of online support of BLM. So hashtag activism is says might be a way to.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I wonder if people have studied hashtag activism, Caitlin, but I guess
I think there has been some work done on this, particularly just since Twitter is the easiest way to get at that, but the hashtags will allow you to filter. And depending on how deeply you're interested in exploring this question, you can content analyze the tone of the tweets that are affiliated with these hashtags. And you can compare, framing in tweets as well, as opposed to narratives in the protest space.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll have to another project to think about. But that is a really good point. Thanks.
Jasmine, I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to let you back. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I just think this is a cool project, so I have a lot of questions. This question actually comes from J. Allen Kendrick's original question about the different treatment effects. But one thing that I'm interested in is, have you thought about so your treatment condition for looting, for example, is saying that there was looting during this protest, but have you thought about whether there may be different effects depending on who's looting, which racial group members are looting, who's burning down buildings, right? The people actually taking part in this activities, and how that has a different effect on how Black people perceive BLM.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I remember when we presented at the conference I mentioned earlier, someone did mention it about, so in addition to the race of the protest person that's doing that, also the race of the police officer involved in the original story. And that sounds really interesting because it's really controversial too, because I do remember, all the media stuff going on about a Black officer was hurt in a demonstration and all of those types of things. I guess what I think about that would probably most likely change the results, because even when we had a dialogue box for respondents in the survey. And a lot of them were reacting a lot to the story, like, this can't keep happening to us. This is like, we're tired of seeing this, like, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think having more complexities of like the racial people involved in the story would move this a lot. It's hard to say directly how, but I do think that's something I would think about exploring. So thank you.
Did you have a?
I just wanted to tack on really quickly and say that in terms of maybe getting some more leverage on the looting treatment, I wonder if it matters what is being looted, whether it's something corporate like a Target versus a street full of small businesses, and how that shifts tone, and whether you might get different responses with that kind of variation. But I know you've already got so many treatments and it's hard to survey a population of purely Black respondents. So I'm trying to complicate things further.
No, I mean, these are all good things to think about, even if it's like its own future project, you know, because there is so many treatments you could do where it kind of gets crazy and you just can't keep up. But that is a good point, because a lot of the narratives particularly on the right, when it came to critiques of Black Lives Matter, was because of like the destruction to small businesses narrative. And that's when you get the vigilantes that come out and are like, I'm protecting my neighborhoods. These are the businesses that I need to protect. And that's just like another element of like anti-BLM. So that would be a really good way to think about it. So yeah, thanks for that suggestion. I have so much to think about.
Well, thank you so much to Leann McLaren for sharing the research that she and her co-author Zoe Walker have conducted. And it's just always such a delight to share the cutting edge scholarship of our graduate school students. Thank you to the audience for your really engaged questions and insights and suggestions for future research opportunities as well. It's been a really rich conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa Bostrom, and I'm part of the planning team for the Race and Bias Conversation series. In the last few minutes, you should have received an email from me inviting you to share feedback on today's conversation. In that message, you'll also find a link to share your ideas for future topics and speakers in the series, and we encourage you to share those suggestions. Please stay tuned for information about our April conversation, which will focus on pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy in the humanities. And we'll share details about that conversation on the website gradschool.duke.edu/RaceBias when the details are finalized. Good afternoon, everyone.